Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we're back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, Trump calls on Supreme Court to keep wrongfully deported Marilyn Favre in El Salvador prison, from independent.co.uk, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, Reddit is always going to try and make Trump look bad, and always going to say he's in the wrong. And yeah, I definitely do think this is an example of them probably being correct on that front. I personally don't really care for, sending all the illegals over to the deporting them all to the El Salvador prison. But, ultimately, the state has the legal monopoly on the use of force to justify whatever it wants to. I personally don't think this guy should have been deported, but, the state, they can deport anyone who they feel like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's because they have the legal monopoly on the use of force. You could try and defend yourself maybe against them, but that they they can justify doing whatever they want to you, pretty much. Well, if you try and defend yourselves against them, you're a criminal. And that just goes to show you how, it's like St. Augustine says, it's pirates and emperors. When the pirate does something, it's a crime. But when a giant empire does something, it's the law. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, U.S. Marshals were mobilized to warn fired DOJ lawyer over congressional testimony, attorney says, from Reuters.com, posted by Tom 13. That's another example of, the state can justify doing whatever it wants. I personally don't think you should be sending marshals out over someone for congressional testimony, but they can do that, I guess. And Reddit only cares about stuff like this because it's just orange man bad. Trump's always in the wrong. Joe Biden could have done the exact same thing during his tenure, and Reddit would either remove or censor the link entirely, or just mass downvote it so it's basically unviewable. And that just goes to show you how, it just depends who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. Then we have lawyer for protester detained at airport after spring break trip with family, from freep.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, I personally don't think people should be detained at the airports after just a spring break trip because of the cause they're protesting. But ultimately, the state has the ability to do whatever it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Reddit only cares currently because, as I've said, it's the out group doing it, and the Republicans rather than the in group and the Democrats. I remember the subreddit for the past 4 years just was constantly either censoring or downvoting any criticism of Biden and his administration at all. But the second Trump takes over, it's all just orange man bad. Give Reddit updates, please. And yeah, it just goes to show you how these people aren't principled. They are just believe whatever they want to in order to say orange man bad, Republicans bad. The Democrats are the greatest party ever. It's like Reddit, it needs to realize that it's a bubble. They say, oh, we're the majority. Well, in reality, a plurality of the population voted for Trump back in November, and I think it would arguably be an even larger number today, especially of how insufferable all these Redditors are. It makes me think, kind of that Reddit is kind of almost like a right-wing psyop to completely discredit the left. That's how insufferable these people are. I almost can't even comprehend them being actual people. These have to be. I almost think they almost have to be bots. But it's just amazing how on Reddit, they one of the big reasons they kicked me off as being a moderator of this subreddit was because I allowed comments from bots. But if I had to stop all the comments from bots, I'd have to ban a lot of the Redditors, because I would argue that average Redditor is more like a bot than most bots are. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, so we get to see who owns the Supreme Court, from Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Leopards Ate My Face subreddit, and that looks like an article from The Guardian. Trump tariffs, right-wing group backed by Koch and Leo sues to stop Trump tariffs. New Civil Liberties Line says president's invocation of emergency powers to impose tariffs is unlawful. And yeah, I personally would probably agree more with Koch and than Trump here. I think Koch's relatively libertarian for a billionaire. I know his brother was the Libertarian Party's vice presidential nominee back in 1980. He passed away in 2019, David Koch. But yeah, I do think the courts are probably owned by the rich, just like all the government's pretty much owned by the rich. I would say big business and big government are often intertwined. That's why I'm surprised you don't have a lot more unity against big business and big government, because back in the Occupy Wall Street era, the Tea Party said, "Oh, big government's the problem." Then the Occupy Wall Street said, "Big business is the problem." They're pretty much the same thing, and that's why they need stuff like the culture war to keep people divided. And yeah, so I guess we'll see who the court sides with. I personally don't really care, and even if the court sides with decide something, ultimately Trump as head of the executive branch can still justify whatever he justifies, and since the executive branch is ultimately what a lot of the force of the state is defers to, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump claims Nazis treated Jewish prisoners with love at press conference with Israeli PM from NewRepublic.com, posted by Help Feeding. And yeah, that's just kind of Trump for you. He's kind of like an IRL shit poster, but I don't know if he was just joking around or maybe he's just that brain dead at this point. Trump always tries to get a rise out of people. It seems. It's every day there's a new controversy of him because he constantly needs to be in the news cycle. But regardless, I definitely would disagree that Nazis treated Jewish prisoners with love. Even if I would counter that with, Adolf Hitler is probably one of the biggest reasons the modern state of Israel exists in the first place, because that allowed them to gain a lot of sympathy after the Holocaust, and then after the Holocaust ended in 1945, they got the modern state of Israel set up in 1948. So that just goes to show you how when you're a victim, people will want to give you things, and that's why everyone on the internet constantly tries to be a victim all the time, I think. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump and Min trying to remove books from online marketplace from Plasman 30, and that's crosswords from the Enough Trump Spam subreddit. And that looks like an email. And the poster OP for that one said, "This is insane. I work for a very large cloud services provider. We have a lot of government clients. On every side of our company sells books online. You have 100% heard of them. Today, my boss got this email that one of our largest gov clients is going to cancel their contract if we don't remove these books that are critical of Trump. This is nuts. We have nothing to do with the book side of the business. And if we did, this is censorship. I can't believe this is happening. My boss is pulling his hair out over this. No one knows what to do." And yeah, Reddit, they're gonna, it could be a fake screenshot because Reddit will believe whatever it wants to believe in order to make Trump look bad, but that's not the angle I'm gonna go with. It could be legitimate, but the thing is that Reddit only cares because Trump is in the out group. They were completely fine with the Biden administration doing the same thing in regards to pressuring Amazon to remove books related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But now that Trump's in power, it's suddenly the worst thing ever, and that's another example of of these people have no principles. It's just Orange Man bad. Anything Orange Man says is bad. Don't believe anything he says. But when it comes to Joe Biden, believe everything he says. He's the greatest thing ever. The only criticism you're allowed to have about him is that he's just not progressive enough. You're not allowed to have any other criticism other than that. And that's why increasingly, it's barely, Reddit just needs to be renamed itself to just DNC Propaganda Generator, because that's increasingly all it is at this point. Then we have defending Trump policies in courts leads to criticism, doubt, and punishment from nytimes.com, from Donald, posted by Donkey, and that's a crossover post from the Tuesday subreddit. And yeah, that's just another Orange Man bad post, I guess. And yeah, if you want to defend Trump's policies in court, you should be able to. But Reddit's always going to say, pretty much say just Orange Man bad, etc., etc. It just kind of gets you down, kind of how bad the Reddit narrative generator gets. But I don't think it's as invulnerable as it seems. Recently John Oliver had an episode on his show about trans athletes, and it was interesting when they uploaded that to the television subreddit. It only got like 50 or so percent upvoted, and a lot of the top comments were against trans athletes competing in the sport of their gender. And they did end up blocking that post, but I definitely do think, it might seem hopeless, but the Reddit, official Reddit narrative generator TM is much more vulnerable than it seems, I think. Then we have Republicans who say they didn't vote for this economic crisis are wrong. Trump is doing exactly what he promised to do with this for his radical tariff regime from MSNBC.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I personally, I guess I would kind of agree with that. I personally don't really care for Trump's tariff plan, but he did kind of say that it was his whole plan during his campaign, so you can't fault him for going back on his word. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Little Donald and his big box of tariffs, and that's from Baton 14. That's a Tom the Dancing Bug comic by Ruben Berlin, it looks like. And yeah, Tom Dancing Bug seems like another one of those Doonesbury's or Bloom counties. The punchline of pretty much every strip is, gee, aren't Republicans bad? And yeah, it looks like a Calvin Hobbes style strip of Donald as Calvin and an older Donald as Hobbes. And yeah, it's pretty much all the tariffs are bad, yeah. And I would agree the tariffs are bad, but as I've said in the past, if it was Biden doing them, suddenly they'd be the greatest thing ever to Reddit, and that just goes to show you how these people don't have values. They have narratives, but they have partisan narratives, and that's a very big difference between them and me. I have values I try and stand up for regardless of which branch of the Uniparty is in power. These people have narratives that say whatever the out-group does is bad, whatever the in-group does is good, with only a few rare exceptions on that front. And yeah, they also added, I follow in these dark times. And yeah, I think it's interesting. I read it's like, oh, these are the darkest times ever. It's not, we just had a global pandemic a couple of years ago. No, these are the darkest times ever because the orange man's back in power. And it's just, you just get tired of the circle jerk after a while. But I think Reddit's hopefully starting to realize it's an awful circle jerk. And hopefully people are gonna start standing up against it. That's why I've been on Reddit for 10 years, and although I don't really like all the circle jerk on it, you gotta stand up against it. You might be downvoted, you might be censored, but you gotta stand up against it. You just can't let these jerks just jerk themselves off constantly. It's pretty much just political masturbation. That's what it is. It's like, out group bad, in group good, and you just jerk yourself off constantly. You can't have that. You gotta have debate and discussion rather than just a circle jerk, and that's why, I gotta hopefully make it on Reddit as long as possible, and this podcast as well, because, I just like telling my perspective on things. If you're fine to agree with that, I'm not gonna belittle you for that. I'm not, average Redditor would say, if you disagree with me at all, you're literally Hitler, a Nazi, etc., etc., etc. And that just goes to show you, people are tired of this, and they're tired of the constant political toxicity, and they're tired of, you disagree with me, you're a Nazi, etc., etc. And yeah, hopefully, I do think we're going to start returning away from that slowly but surely, and that's my thoughts there. And I'll see if there's anything else new on the subreddit. Looks like there isn't, so I'm going to wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.